And we are now live. Welcome to the NSDMG seminar program. And tonight at 6 o'clock, we've got Mark McDonough, retired U.S. Navy captain, talking to the subject of Chernobyl, what really happened. And as you can see, there's me as the moderator. I'm Merle Robinson, and I will field your questions that you put into the comments field. And when Mark takes a breath, I'll try to insert those into the discussion. We also have Ryan Pierce and Elizabeth. Help me with your pronunciation, Elizabeth. I've never done it right. Kaprinsky? I hope I'm doing it right. I'm probably not. But they may also chime in with a couple of questions. But we're going to go straight into the presentation. And most of the time, you're going to see slides, and I'll be watching for your questions. So, Mark, take it away.
Hi, how do you do? My name is Mark McDonough. I'm a retired U.S. Navy captain. We have Ryan and Elizabeth here to help out as well. They've been to Chernobyl and other places like that. They have background information on what's real. I have technical information. I'm going to get kind of technical here, trying to discuss on a physics and engineering level what was wrong with the Chernobyl design and what was wrong with what they did on that night. My background is I am a retired U.S. Navy captain, submarine background, so I'm trained in nuclear power by this Navy nuclear submarine force. A lot of my perceptions and philosophies are based on U.S. Designs and engineering, and I'll try to point that out when I understand that the Soviets and Russians are going to see things slightly differently than what I do. I spent 10 years in active duty in submarines, 20 in the reserves. When I left active duty, I got my master's science degree in physics, and I've been working for a company in Groton, Connecticut, working on the submarine base, doing operations analysis and support of submarine operations and tactics. And that's me. I live in Connecticut with my wife and 9 cats, a dog, and at the moment 22 rats. They're fosters, and we're probably going to have 5 foster kittens tomorrow, Sunday. So bottle feeding and all the whole thing. We've done it. We enjoy it. Okay. So a little bit about who we are. We're the national security decision-making game. We've been for 30 years now this year. We have been putting on simulations, live action. Some people call it live action role playing, but our stick is it's the world as you know it, and we put together models of contemporary world nations, real nations with their real problems, and they're really modeling the decision-making system. So we like to think it's fun, but you hope we'll come away with some knowledge of what this country is, these other countries, what the international relations are, some perspective on diplomacy, on communications, on negotiations, and how other governmental systems work and what their issues are. Anyway, we provide these lectures and seminars while we're there at conventions. We provide lectures and seminars on historical, military, and technology topics. Try to figure out how world decisions are made. Our team includes government, academic, and business people with wargame experience. So, disclaimer is there's no classified information in here. Well, at least we hope. They're based on public information. Might be public information that many of us have received in the course of our work, but it's based on public information. Fair use doctrine, etc. Any opinions are our own and not anyone else. Certainly, most of us have at some point in our careers worked for the federal government in some capacity. This is not a federal thing. They don't know we're here. They don't care, and we don't speak for the U.S. government or any other. Where we can be found this year, of course, everything's closed down. DragonCon is online. We'll be at DragonCon planned for Labor Day weekend. We're also hoping on getting to Escape Velocity online. That's a fantasy science fiction convention in the Washington, D.C. area, but it's going to be all online, usually events in the evenings throughout all of October. So look for us there when you want. And we're also going to be trying to put together one or more variations of our actual game that can be played online. We've experimented already with our Cuban Missile Crisis game, and that seems to be okay to run. We just didn't think it was ready for prime time for Gen Con. We'll probably have that online for DragonCon. Okay. So we may start here. Just to get us all baseline, I want to go into some of the lexicon we want to talk about when we talk about a nuclear reactor accident or nuclear catastrophe. Radiation, there's radiation and contamination. One thing that whenever I watch a TV show that gets under my skin is when they confuse those. And they're two different things. They're related to each other in terms of the damage it can do, but we'll go over what we mean. Radiation, there are primarily four types of radiation. Alpha radiation, which is a helium nucleus. The reason why it's radiation instead of a helium nucleus ionized, it's moving very, very fast. That means it will part for its size, a lot of kinetic energy, and when it slows down, it usually can't hurt you physiologically because it will it's a big thing. It's got a huge charge, and it's like trying to get a bowling ball through a mouse hole. It stops when it hits your epidermis. It doesn't go in very deep. The most you might get there is a mild sunburn, and won't hit anything below that will do more damage. If it does hit you in something that's damaging live tissue, it could do a lot of damage. So alpha could be a problem if it is ingested on something that gets ingested. We'll talk about contamination later. But if it gets into your lungs, if it gets into your stomach, if it gets into your bloodstream, it then gives off that alpha near to living cells, and that can be very damaging because individually the alpha particle has a lot of energy. Beta radiation is an electron moving at very high speed. It's also a positron, which is the anti-electron, antimatter versus the electron. Moving at high speed, it can do some damage to you. It will usually go a few centimeters into your body, so it could do something there. The positron's worse than the electron because in addition to having the energy, it's also a particle of antimatter, and as soon as it slows down, it will find an electron and do pair annihilation, and it will release that much of additional energy. Gamma radiation is electromagnetic radiation. It's like light, only it's very high frequency. It's beyond ultraviolet. It's very high frequency, very short wavelength, carries a lot of energy. It will go right through you and will potentially break cell bonds, break down your molecules, and create damage in that manner. And neutron radiation is a neutron at very high speed. A neutron's a neutron, but if it's at a high speed, its radiation will go through you, and it also creates cellular damage. Now, contamination means it's matter that actually emits radiation. Radiation, by its nature, moves at or near the speed of light. It's through your room, through your town, faster than you can measure it. It's a particle that goes. Contamination, though, is a dust or a gas that is unstable in emitting one of these particles or water. Surface contamination is something that's on the surface of the table. It's settled. You put your hands on it, then we'll be talking a lot about surface contamination with COVID-19, of course. You put your hand on it, next thing you know, you're touching your face, or it's landed on your food or whatever, and you've ingested it. Air, you inhale it, it's often a dust or a gas, and you breathe it in, exhale it, but while it's in your lungs, it creates a problem. If it's particulate, not a gas, it can remain in your lungs for a few hours to a few months, and that means it will give up essentially most of its burden, most of its radiation while it's in your lungs to do damage. Actually, gaseous radiation is usually not that much of a problem because you inhale it and you exhale it, and it's only in your lungs for a few seconds. Water, of course, that could be a problem. If you drink it, it will frequently get into your bloodstream, and then its entire burden is likely to end up also getting injected into you. So the two different things: radiation flies right through the air. Contamination is something that gives off radiation.
Mark, we've had a couple people comment on your sound quality. Can you try to enunciate and hold your speaker better?
Okay, will do. I'll see what I can do. If it continues, please let me know. I will try to get another headset. That'll take me about a minute. But this is a new contraption. Worked all right this morning, but maybe people just didn't comment on it. Okay. Now where are we? Yes. More on the lexicon. In terms of a nuclear reactor, the core is the central element of the nuclear reactor that contains the fissionable material. Usually contains coolant water channels, and will create channels to insert reactor control rods. That's what the core is when we refer to a nuclear reactor. Reactivity is something that considers like acceleration. You add reactivity, you remove reactivity. When you put something in that makes the power tend to go up. You're said to be adding reactivity. You're said to be removing reactivity when you do something that tends to reduce reactor power. Control rods, as an example, insert or remove reactivity. If you withdraw the control rods, you're taking control rods out of the reactor. You're said to be adding reactivity. When you are inserting the control rods, you are removing reactivity. Terms you will run into, we're all referring to reactor criticality. Critical reactor means that the number of neutrons in one generation is the same as the number of neutrons in the next generation, meaning the power is stable. It's not going up, it's not going down. The reactor is critical. Critical usually sounds like this charged, dangerous word, but it's exactly what you want if you want to be operating a reactor. You want to be critical. Subcritical means that the reactor's power is dropping slowly or quickly, but a subcritical reactor means that there are fewer neutrons each generation, fewer fissions each generation. Supercritical means that there are more. Power will be going up. That's not a bad thing. If you want to raise power, you need to go supercritical. Prompt supercritical is something else. We have something we call prompt neutrons. When you have a fissionable material fission, such as uranium-235 fissions, it will release a certain number of neutrons. Those neutrons then move on in a critical reactor to create more fissions, cause more fissions among more U-235 atoms. Now, a certain number of those neutrons released, about 93%, if memory serves, that's 89%, as memory serves, are prompt neutron releases. That means that the fission occurs and the neutron is released. The neutrons are released so fast that it can't be measured. Usually, nuclear engineers work on units of measure called the shake. A shake of a lamb's tail is where that comes from, and a shake is 10 to the minus 14 seconds. So we're talking, the 100 trillionth of a second, less than that. So that can't be measured, can't be operated. So those neutrons are released instantly, but about 11% of the neutrons will be released by the decay of other fission products. That decay might take place in a few seconds, might take place in a few hours, but those neutrons contribute to the reaction that keeps the reactor critical. And in fact, those neutrons are what you can control the reactor on. If the small but very significant fraction of the neutrons are what allow the reactor to go up, power to go up or down rather slowly, and you can control that. You can't possibly control a reactor that's critical strictly on its on the prompt neutrons that are released in a trillionth of a second. And that condition is called prompt supercriticality. It's what you want to avoid. It's what a nuclear bomb needs, and it's what Chernobyl had for a moment. Now, in poison, the term poison in terms of nuclear engineering refers to a material that is added to the reactor to insert negative reactivity. It tends to poison the reaction and shut the reactor down. When you are driving control rods into the reactor core, you are inserting poison. As we'll talk about later, dumping boron into the Chernobyl core was adding poison. Boron is a notable poison. So that's what poison means in nuclear engineering sense. Now, moderator. A moderator is something that slows neutrons down. Neutrons' ability to create another fission, to get another uranium out of the fission and cause a chain reaction, is based on their speed. Very fast neutrons that are released almost immediately have a fairly small cross-section at which they can be absorbed and cause another reaction among another uranium atom. But when they slow down to what we call thermal speeds, which is they're moving by Brownian motion, they're in thermal equilibrium with their surroundings, they have much larger capture cross-section or fission cross-section for the uranium, and they become much more effective in terms of keeping your reaction going. The moderator is something that is in there to slow the neutrons down and try to get them to a state at which they're going to move on to create more fissions. If they don't slow down, they'll be out of the core instantly and they're lost to the system. So every reactor needs a moderator of some type. The moderator types most commonly used are heavy water, which are water that has a high fraction of deuterium based on natural conditions. That means it has that is often desirable because it has a small neutron capture cross section itself. The neutron moderator will sometimes act as a poison and suck up some of those neutrons. So heavy water is sometimes used for that. It is tough for it's very expensive, though, to use heavy water. Light water means real water, just regular distilled water, the way we might get out of an evaporator. And that's what we tend to use in the United States, and most reactors, in fact, have gone to using light water. It works good as works fairly well as a moderator. It does get activated, which means the water running through your core will sometimes get a lot of will sometimes get a little bit of reactivity. Now, graphite is frequently used. It's a very good moderator. It has a small capture cross section for neutrons, so it doesn't tend to poison, but it does tend to turn neutrons back. It is very desirable from an engineering sense. From a safety sense, it's very problematic. A lot of reactors have had problems with that. The graphite gets heated very hot in these reactors, and the only thing that keeps them from bursting into flames, because they're heated beyond their activation temperature, is that they're submerged in water. The British had a problem with a reactor plant that ended up draining and exposing graphite, and that started to burn. And Chernobyl we will see had similar problems. So we will most reactor designs have moved away from graphite as a moderator. Graphite is desirable often for
Mark, we're still having some complaints about sound. People that were in the morning session said they didn't have a problem, but they're having a lot of static and pops and cracks tonight.
Yeah, I don't think I'm doing anything different. Did anything just get better?
A little bit. I was getting a little bit of popping and cracking, but not to the degree that we seem to be getting comments about.
See if putting it right in front of my face helps at all, getting it away from anything. But I'm not doing anything any differently than I was this morning.
You seem much clearer all of a sudden.
Okay, maybe that's good. Sorry then. Okay, so I was saying graphite is often useful because it's a good enough moderator that you don't have to enrich your uranium too much. And enriching uranium is a very expensive process. That's trying to make the concentration of uranium that is U-235 higher than it is naturally to U-238. U-238 doesn't do a very good job of giving you a chain reaction, but the U-235 is what you want, but it's an expensive process. So people use graphite in order to avoid having to do that, and that's why they did that at Chernobyl. As far as coolant, also coolant, light water and heavy water. Liquid metal, liquid sodium has been used as a coolant. We've gotten away from that because that's tough to do, but has a very small capture cross section for neutrons, so you don't have to worry about it poisoning your reactor. But the advantage of using light water, heavy water is the same thing that you're using as a coolant, you're using as a moderator. Now, decay heat is something else we need to know about when we're talking about a nuclear reactor and a nuclear reactor problem. If you're running a nuclear reactor at 100% power, steady state for days, and you drive all the reactor rods in, you shut the reactor down, it will generally continue about 7% of the heat that was given off before. So you need to be prepared when you shut down a reactor from high power to continue your coolant, to keep cooling it for as long as you're going to need to for it. And it could take months for it to entirely decay away to the point where you don't need to keep it immersed and don't need to keep a flow of water through it. Okay, fissile material, what actually creates your fissions. U-235 in nuclear reactors is the most desirable. Now, natural uranium is mostly U-238. U-235 has to be extracted or enriched if you want to make it that. So yeah, that's in use. Plutonium-239 does not exist in nature anymore. Whatever might have been produced by the supernovas that seeded our solar system with heavy metals has decayed away long ago. So plutonium U-239 is preferred by a lot of weapons designers, and it has to be manufactured in nuclear reactors. Usually U-238 in nuclear reactor cores is activated to plutonium-239, and that's extracted chemically to make a nuclear weapon. Enrichment, we talked about that. That is the extent to which a uranium core, a uranium element is enriched in U-235 beyond what what the natural U-235 concentration is. And that is, as I mentioned, an expensive process. Fission product. A fission product is something that is produced by a fission. When a U-235 atom splits, it splits into 2 or more fragments, and those are referred to as fission products. They're often radioactive, and they'll have various components. You run into fission products that you will not meet in nature because they're generally short-lived, and anything that was ever produced by nature is long since decayed away. But we're going to find a lot of critters coming out of these reactors, radionuclides, that we have never encountered. We have never encountered before. Now, fission product poison is a certain type of fission product that also acts as a poison. Some of the things that the nuclear reactor makes tends to shut down the reaction or add negative reactivity. And once you're in a balance with the control rods in the right place, one thing balances out the other, and you remain critical. But that's one of the reasons why we have control rods, to account for the effects. Primary and secondary refer to the cooling systems. The primary system is a water system that gets pumped through the reactor that provides coolant to the reactor and draws the heat away so that you can use it to make steam, make energy. It'll also usually, in most designs, since it's water, serves as a moderator. The secondary is where it transfers you through a heat exchanger its energy too. So you have one water system, usually at high pressure, or often not permitted to boil because it's so high pressured. That is potentially radioactive, transferring through a heat exchanger, U-tubes and a heat exchanger, its heat to a secondary system. It works the same way as a boiler would. It boils water in a secondary system. That actually goes through your turbines. That is generally not contaminated or very light in any measurable way. Now, containment is, in nuclear engineering terms, a structure airtight that is placed around the reactor. You'll have airtight doors that you can enter and leave through, but you will generally keep those closed except when you're moving through. Containment is typical, and containment vessel around most Western reactors is typical. Chernobyl did not have a containment system. It's expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and the Soviets did not believe that it was necessary. SCRAM is a nuclear engineering term. It's officially subcriticality reactivity addition method. That's what it stands for. People say SCRAM the reactor. That means insert the system that does the subcriticality reactivity addition method. Now you know what subcriticality means. You know what reactivity means. So it adds negative reactivity to drive the reactor subcritical and shuts down the reactor very, very quickly. Now, I also heard the anecdote from back in the nuclear pilot days at the University of Chicago during the Manhattan Project that they came up with the word SCRAM, and it stood for subcritical reactivity Axeman. Now, the University of Chicago, the atomic pilot they built, they pulled the control rods out with a series of ropes tied to one rope and a chain, and they yanked that all in. And there was a man with an axe meant to cut the rope if there was a problem, and he was the axe man, and the system with subcritical reactivity axe man. I don't know how true that is. It's a great story, though. Safety control rod axe man. Okay, that makes sense, Dave. I can see that too. Okay, now we can start talking about Chernobyl. They called the Chernobyl an RBMK reactor design. It's something in Russian. My Russian is 30 years stale, so I'm not going to try to figure out whatever it said. The design itself was able to produce power and produce plutonium for weapons. Here in the West, we typically try to keep our power reactor systems and our nuclear weapons production systems as two completely separate industries that didn't share anything. Whether or not the Soviets actually ever produced plutonium in these RBMK designs, or not is a matter of conjecture. Knowing the Soviets the way I do, I can't see why they wouldn't. I do know that in the Cold War, our intelligence communities were frequently surprised by the amount of nuclear material the Soviets seemed to have, because it didn't match their projections to what the Soviet nuclear industries were able to do. And that the RBMK could produce plutonium for weapons makes sense that they would have done that. The RBMK is light water cooled and it's graphite moderated. This allowed them to use reactor control elements, uranium elements that were typically about 20 degrees enriched, 20% enriched. I don't remember what the natural enrichment is. I think Ryan, Elizabeth, I think you told me that last year. What's the natural U-235 and concentration in uranium ore?
7%.
What is it?
0.7% is uranium dug out of the ground. Is going to be 0.7% U-235.
Okay, so 0.7%, and they have to go through an enrichment system to try to get it up to 20% for Chernobyl. And I understood that they actually had some of them that were generally raw uranium, and a lot that they were able to enrich into 20%.
Wait, 20%? Where are you getting that number from?
I don't remember the specific source. Why? Do you have something else?
Yeah, Chernobyl actually is kind of the opposite. It does use enriched uranium, but it's only enriched by, I think, like around 2-3% thereabouts. And in fact, the fact that the uranium is low enriched actually makes the reactor harder to control and more dangerous at low power levels. And so one of the changes that was made was they used slightly higher enrichment fuel. But we're still talking on the order of 2, 3, 4%, definitely below 5.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. They definitely wanted to try to keep the enrichment down because that's the cheapest way to make the type of power that they needed. My understanding is that a lot of the rods were enriched to 20%, but they had a lot of raw out of the ground rods at the same time. Anyway, the advantages of the advantages of the system they had low fuel enrichment. They had about 3,000 cells, that is uranium cells, and they were able to remove those and replace them constantly. They could refuel that at power. They could go along without shutting the reactor down. They could pull out a fuel cell, drop it in a pool, and insert a new one in that slot. That's something we'd never dream of trying to do here. And of course, the speculation as far as weapons is that they dropped it in that pool, let it cool off radiologically for a few months, and then they could transport it to a weapon system for processing to extract the plutonium. And if they're using, again, less enriched uranium, there's a lot of U-238 in there that's been turned into plutonium-239, so they could potentially get a rich yield of fission material for nuclear weapons. But they can keep the reactor plant up. They could start it up and run it at power and keep it running for, in theory, as long as they wanted to. We, however, have to start a reactor up. It's most efficient to start to take run of our reactors up to 100% power, run at 100% power for a year and a half, 2 years, shut it down, and replace the entire core. Okay, here is where Chernobyl is, right in the near the border between the Ukraine and Belarus. The insert picture here is from a documentary, not the most recent HBO, but it's not a picture that we have of the Chernobyl itself. But it shows you what an RBMK interior is going to look like.
Stick around for my talk, and you're going to see a lot more of those pictures.
Yes, Ryan and Elizabeth will be talking at 8 o'clock about vacationing at sunny Chernobyl. Spoiler: it's sunny, but the sunscreen isn't going to help you. Okay, and this is the top of the core. Each of those little squares is a fuel cell that can be extracted and inserted. Some of them are, or some of the channels will be control rods. Now, design weaknesses of Chernobyl. I call them weaknesses, but that's my Western perspective. And it's a positive void coefficient. The void coefficient means that if a void forms in the coolant tunnel, meaning a steam bubble, not water, it's much less dense, so it's considered a void. it lets more neutrons through that allow those neutrons to hit the graphite instead of getting absorbed somewhere in a non-fission nuclear event. And they hit the graphite, they become moderated, so now they're more attracted to causing fission with uranium. So bubbles tending to form in the reactor core are voids, and they tend to add reactivity or raise power. So you have a reactor system that's where the temperature or the power is rising, it starts to make more bubbles because it's making more steam, and that tends to raise the power more. It's a typically unstable system. By its nature, it's an unstable system, but they understood that. It's factored into the design, so they considered that to be okay. We don't like void. We design our reactors to have negative void coefficients. The fire potential of the graphite moderator, as I described, if you just grab the graphite out of the core at power and toss it on the ground, expose it to air, it will burst into flames. The control rod design was a graphite leader. It's a weakness, but I don't think it's a design flaw. Now, a rod leader is something at the tip of the control rod that adds reactivity instead of reducing reactivity. The control rod is, of course, supposed to reduce reactivity, but you end up increasing your rod worth or making the rod more effective by having something at the tail end that does the reverse. You know, I've seen usually designs where there's actually a chunk of enriched U-235 at the end of your control rods. What happens is you're going to have a control rod, you're going to have your reactor core, it's going to look something like this, and you're pulling your control rods from the bottom to the top. That means you're going to be depleting the uranium at the base of the core more, and as the reactor core ages, you're pulling the rods out more and more, and the neutron flux, the reaction is going to be moving up. So what happens when you start to push the rod in that has a rod leader, when you start to push that into the core, it pushes that reactivity increasing thing into depleted sections where it doesn't do as much, while it inserts poison into the active sections where it's doing more. So it makes the control rod do more for you. You have better control over the reactor in that way, and that will spiral through your design processes to help you put the thing together in a less robust manner, cheaper. So it's a typical design standard. Now it has a slow scram system by our standard. I don't know where I got that datum anymore, but I read that at some point that their scram was slow compared to our Western systems. Their personnel training and education. That they kind of brought this out in the HBO documentary when the lead nuclear engineer they discovered was 26 years old. That the personal training and education on the site was limited compared to what we have. A lot of the people who work in the Chernobyl site came from conventional power reactors, didn't know anything about the nuclear systems they were dealing with. This is also the accident also happened on an evening watch where they didn't have their first string educated people in. They just had people who thought they could be, who they felt competent to be administrators of a system operating in steady state. And there was no containment to this. Any release of fission material from the Chernobyl reactor, there was no airtight system to keep it contained in the plant. Now, one thing we're going to get kind of complicated here, but Xenon 135 was crucial to what happened in the Chernobyl accident. Xenon 135 is a fission product poison. And in fact, it's the most powerful known neutron absorber. And Xenon 135 doesn't occur naturally in nature. Most of the Xenon 135 you're going to find in nuclear reactor is the product of tellurium 135 and iodine decay. These are the tellurium 135 and iodine 135 are, again, strange birds that you're not going to find in nature. They're made by fissions. And tellurium 135 decays with a half-life of 12 seconds. That doesn't stick around very long. Iodine 135 decays with a half-life of 6.57 hours. That sticks around for a while. And the tellurium decays to iodine, beta decay. The iodine decays to xenon 135, which has a 9.2 hour. Now, half-life. Now, when it's Xenon 135, it's going to sit there and absorb neutrons in processes that don't cause fissions. So what you have to do if you want to have Xenon 135 in your core, and you will, is you have to have your control rods pulled out in order to make up for that, add the added reactivity. Now, it decays with a 9.2-hour half-life. Some will also be absorbed by absorbing a neutron. When it absorbs a neutron, poisoning the reactor a little bit, it decays into something else as well that is no longer a fission product poison. So you can burn Xenon out by raising your power. And now, in steady state power, let's say you're operating your reactor at 100% power, you're creating a certain amount of tellurium, a certain amount of iodine, a certain amount of xenon by the chain reaction, by uranium-235 fission, and more is being produced in sequence by natural decay, and it's getting burned out, and it's decaying by itself, and it's all in steady state, and everything's fine. It's unnoticeable to you. Now, if you drop power from 100% to, say, 20%, what will happen is the tellurium's largely not there anymore because it decays off in 12 seconds. But the iodine concentration with the 6.5-hour half-life is going to stick around. That's going to be there, and it's going to continue to decay and make more xenon as if you were at 100% power. Because the amount of xenon in steady state at 100% power is larger than the amount of xenon in steady state at 50% power, but you're not in steady state anymore because you just change power levels. What happens is you're going to be making more xenon than you're burning out. And there'll be a spike in the xenon concentration in your reactor that will functionally have about a 5-hour lifetime before you're going to start to see it peak and start to drop off again. And if you don't know what's happening, it's going to create power fluctuations that you're not prepared for, and it will be confusing to you. So that's one of the things that went on. They ended up with a xenon spike that they didn't particularly recognize or weren't able to deal with properly. In large commercial reactors, we are trained to change power levels very slowly, ramp up maybe 5 degrees an hour, ramp down 5 degrees an hour. So just to kind of try to avoid these xenon transients. In the nuclear Navy, we didn't have the option to do that. You want to go from low speed to high speed. We're also trained to deal with that and understand what was happening to us. Now that day go ahead, Ryan.
Analogy that I find that's really helpful for understanding this is the xenon being like a brake in a car and the reactivity of the rods being like the accelerator. Imagine trying to drive a car with the safety brake on and your brake pedal all the way to the metal and your accelerator all the way down too, and trying to control the car speed that
way. Yep. Good. Now, on that day, there was a safety test plan for the day shift. Now, the day shift, they also had the people come in during the day who were the best trained and best educated. These are the people who had more engineering degrees among them, and they were prepared for the test. They knew what they were trying to do. They were ready to do it. The test was to test the ability of the reactor to maintain cooling on in the event of a loss of power or loss of control, potentially an attack. And what they wanted to do is see if the turbines that are making power, that are keeping the reactor cooling pumps running, are able to keep emergency pumps running for at least 40 seconds. That was the necessary time for the diesel generators to pick up the load and keep the coolant running. The test plan was to run at 1,000 megawatts power. That's about 30% of full power. And that was where they were supposed to run the test. The day shift slowly reduced the power to 1,600 megawatts in preparation for that. Now, the previous units this Chernobyl unit had failed the test twice already. I think previous units at Chernobyl had also failed the test. So there's a lot of sensitivity to try to get this thing running. But while they were preparing to do this test or expecting to do this test, there was another reactor in the Ukraine that went offline, and they were requested to keep power on long enough to the peak early evening hours. So they couldn't run the test. They couldn't take Chernobyl offline. They handed the test off the night shift. Now, on the night shift, nobody there knew of the test or even the complexities of reactor dynamics. Now, the HBO series lets me think that maybe they knew a little bit, but we'll discuss that at the end. They weren't as prepared as the morning shift, and they didn't know what they were doing. Now power's fallen and it can't get up. In preparation for the test, they quickly dropped power to 1,000 megawatts. Now that's where the Xenon started to take over. The power continued to drop because they stopped burning out the Xenon, yet they were still getting a bunch of addition Xenon from tellurium and iodine decay. So power drop continued to 30 megawatts, and they were unable to control it. They kept pulling rods out to try to bring power back up, but they only get it to about 200 megawatts. They decided to run the test even though they were outside the parameters of the test. Now, they started the emergency coolant pumps up for the test. At that point, the problem is the positive void coefficient begins to enter the picture. The additional coolant flow disrupted steam flow formation in the core. So instead of more steam bubbles, they're making fewer steam bubbles. It's a negative void coefficient. A positive void coefficient they have, but there are now fewer voids, and there are more neutrons are escaping the core. So power starts to drop even more. They're losing more neutrons. They can't keep the reactor critical. Power drops more. So they continue to pull rods until the rods are all the way out. I think the statement is they had 200 plus rods pulled all the way out of the core and about 7 rods still in the core. To me, that's a nightmare. That's actually stupid. You can't possibly consider that that's a safe condition to be in. The rods are the only thing that allow you to control a nuclear reactor, and withdrawing them, you're giving up all control. That's like you're putting your blinders on the highway, and to go back to Ryan's analogy of the car. Now you take off all the brakes, put a blindfold on, and floor it. All right. So power begins to spike. For the test, they shut the steam lines to run the test, shut the steam lines to the turbines, let the turbines wind down, and see if they can continue to provide power. That simulates the loss of coolant to the reactor, the test they wanted. The primary plant now starts to heat up. Steam bubbles start to form again in the core, and that adds reactivity. What the reactivity they removed, they're now adding back in again. So they're getting those bubbles in. Those bubbles are allowing the neutrons to reach the graphite moderator. The neutron flux, the amount of neutrons in the core is of thermal neutrons is rising and creating more power. So power starts to rise. They're adding reactivity. Power starts to rise. They run the emergency coolant pumps. They're spinning down the turbines. The OK is working so far for 36 seconds. But power starts rising to the point where the reactivity rises to the point where they become supercritical, and they start to burn xenon out. That adds even more reactivity, and power is building faster. So they see power beginning to rise in a way they don't even know. They don't understand. The operator reacts by hitting the scram, the OZ5 button, and with the HBO series right, and I believe it is, after 36 seconds. Doesn't realize that hitting the scram button is actually not the right thing to do at that point. There isn't a right thing to do at that point. They've screwed the pooch. But once they have all the reactor control out of the reactor, the graphite tips the control rods, which are the reactivity they had as rod leaders, enters the core first. Now it adds even more reactivity to a reactor at which is having its power spiked. The entire sequence of adding reactivity to the most reactive part of the reactor while they're burning out xenon, while they're creating steam bubbles, the power spikes, they become prompt supercritical. The control rods fracture. They block the control channel. The fuel rods fracture. They block the control channel, so the reactor control rods jam halfway in, a third of the way in. The mathematical and physical modeling that this is a reactor built for 3.2 gigawatts of thermal power for about 1 gigawatt of electrical power, but 3.2 watts of thermal power is what it's designed for, and spiked to 30 gigawatts, so nearly 10 times what its design power thermal output is. That causes explosion. Massive superheated steam flashes, blows off the top of the reactor vessel and blows through the roof of the building. The fuel cells rupture and they melt. That contaminates the whole mess. There's nothing hotter radiologically than a melted used reactor fuel cell. So that contaminates everything. Now the graphite moderator, it's above its activation energy, it's above its flash point, and once it's exposed to air, it starts to burn. The smoke starts to carry away the contaminated fuel and contaminates everything around it. The control room staff continue to fight the casualties. They don't really know what just happened, but they know it was bad. The radiation monitor in the control room only goes up to 3.2 rem an hour. Now we'll talk about, come back at 10 o'clock, I'll discuss the terms Rankine, rem, and a lot of these other things when I talk about radiological weapons and the physiological effects of radiation exposure. REM is, it's what I'm trained to deal with, is about the same thing as a Rankine. I'm taught that 500 Rankine exposure will kill you 50% of the time without medical attention. So 3.2 rem an hour is not a bad, it's not anything you want to walk into, but it's not necessarily anything. But it's really about 20,000 rem an hour what they were dealing with. They'll get, at that point, they'll get a lethal dose in about 90 seconds. Nearly all of them will die in the next 3 weeks. Same thing with a lot of the first responders who showed up. In the aftermath of the explosion, they evacuated the town of Pripyat, quote, temporarily, unquote. Nobody ever came back. Well, the occupants never came back to live there. Ryan and Elizabeth will talk to you about visiting Pripyat. They didn't make any announcements internationally. Swedish reactor facility discovered the problem when their radiation alarm started to go off. They started to say, "There's something's happened somewhere." They realized it wasn't them; that it was actually happened to come across the border from Russia. Took the Russian states to put out the fire. They dropped boron on it to shut down the fission. As I mentioned, this is a problem that had never existed before. You had a reactor core that was still critical and open to the atmosphere. And one of the things you do to shut down a reactor is to poison it, and boron is a poison. So they were taking helicopters, they were trying to lob the poison into the reactor containment system to shut that down, and ultimately that worked. In total, and I know it's up in the air how many people actually died of radiation exposure. The one source I said 55. I think that's plant workers. I think that's probably low, but you can't really get a good number. And today, well, over the next few months, they seal the building in a concrete sarcophagus in the area as it goes to town. Now, if you haven't seen the HBO series, I encourage you to do that. But I had some thoughts on that. One of the things that I wasn't sure about is they showed people showing the effects of radiation exposure literally within minutes of the explosion. I wondered about that, and that's why I did the research and put together the presentation I'm going to be giving at 10 o'clock. Well, I'll discuss some of the physiological effects, how quickly it's going to kick in. And yes, it is possible to start showing symptoms of radiation exposure, but you've probably gotten at that point 3, 4, 5, 10,000 rem, so you're a goner if that's the case. Now, the knowledge of the reactor dynamics is part of the on-watch staff, especially Xenon 135. In the HBO series, there was one mention of one of the operators talking about being in the Xenon trough. Wasn't explained. It was explained in the after the courtroom scene what Xenon was and what it did on an extent, but there was no indication that they understood in that control room other than that one thing, that one mention. Certainly, it seemed that they didn't understand what was happening to the reactor and plant, and that makes sense to me. It shows a helicopter crash in the series. A helicopter flew into the cloud. Next thing they knew, it was coming apart. The series kind of suggested that somehow the contamination took the helicopter down. But what really happened, and Ryan's the person who told me about this, is that it hit a guy wire as it flew through the cloud, and that took a rotor off, and that took down the helicopter.
Quick note on that. I just recently seen this. Now that they have the Chernobyl sarcophagus covered and they're starting to take the roof off of the sarcophagus, they've actually found the tail rotor of that helicopter that they built the sarcophagus over.
Yeah,
it was freaky watching that picture, but they found part of it.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. In the movie, they talked about the risk of a steam explosion when the melted core actually hit a pool of water underneath. I think they grossly overstated the damage potential. They talked about the equivalent of multi-megaton explosion. You don't get a multi-megaton explosion without a nuclear yield. So I think they did want to convey how bad the situation would have been if the steam explosion occurred underneath the core that was already so wildly contaminated and blew the rest of it into fragments and out of the building. That would have been bad, but I think they dramatically overstated that. The movie also, the series also blamed the graphite rod followers as a design flaw. They're an industry standard. I don't think it's a design flaw that they inserted them. They make your rod design more efficient. I blame, however, the Chernobyl design that allows the operator to completely withdraw a control rod from the core. That to me is silly. Shouldn't have happened. And if they didn't do that, then it wouldn't have been. They wouldn't have a problem with their control rod followers actually doing the opposite of what they wanted to do when they tried to shut the reactor down. And we just have some pretty pictures here. This is a Soviet helicopter beginning to trail some boron, trying to drop it into the core to shut down the reaction. Some of the interior pictures, burned out control room, of course, this is how it was blown open, testing people out to see if they're contaminated. The fallout cloud. Briefing the damage, what they're going to do about it, and sarcophagus placing over it. That Ryan, are you going to talk about the sarcophagus in your pitch in an hour?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, you're going to see inside the sarcophagus.
Oh, okay, great. So everybody, please stick around for Ryan and Elizabeth to hear them talk about their experiences actually there. But this is in place, and Chernobyl's going to be hot for thousands of years to come. So what does the future hold with regard to nuclear reactors? Nuclear reactors could be potentially a terrorist target. So you bring your own bomb, bring your own biological materials. They hit a nuclear reactor, they got a dirty bomb if they can get in there. Personnel quality. Every accident we've had from SL1 through 3 Mile Island, Chalk River, Chernobyl, maybe Fukushima, had a major human error elements to that accident. The quality of personnel, we like to think we're hiring good people and we're training them very well. There's always that, in John F. Kennedy's term, there's always some schmuck that doesn't get the word. But I find you get exactly the wrong two people on watch at exactly the wrong time, that they're not backing each other up, and that's when accidents occur. And you can't really foresee that too much. We try to design into all of our components, all of our systems, and all the fail safes. And a lot of things go wrong when somebody overrides some automatic protective feature because they think they know more than the system does. That's certainly Chernobyl. They violated every rule in the book. 3 Mile Island. Things that they should have recognized that they didn't. As far as incorporating new technologies, there's always going to be a drive on the part of any industry to be more efficient and reduce costs. We like to think that we retain things safe. The nuclear power industry usually ends up saying, okay, they'll embrace any new technology as long as it's got a proven 20-year track history of successful operation. So by tech tends to lead things, but there's always going to, who are you going to get to? The Chernobyl series suggested that the problem was that the Soviets were trying to make reactor power too cheap. I don't know that that's the issue, but this drive for efficiency and cost reduction to try to make that megawatt hour of power cost less to produce is always going to be a potential factor in incorporating new technologies and sometimes maybe cutting corners. Now, energy policy and issues. The incorporation of nuclear power or more or less nuclear power affects oil prices, affects greenhouse emissions, growing industrial bases, developing nations being able to develop without relying on coal or oil. And of course, weapons programs. That nuclear radiological weapons are a potential potential outcome of some of these product of some of these things. Start over, rinse, repeat, over and over until we get this. Okay. So that's what I have on Chernobyl. We'll address questions now. I also want to let you know that if you want more on Chernobyl, stick around. 8 o'clock, Ryan and Elizabeth will be giving their vacationing in sunny Chernobyl lecture. If you want to know more about radiation, stick around to 10 o'clock to midnight tonight. I know that's a marathon session for you, but I'm doing it. You can. And I'll be discussing radiological weapons and the physiological effects of exposure from 10 to midnight. Probably won't go that long, but I will.
So, Mark, we had a couple of questions I deferred. One was regards to what were the most dangerous reactors still out there, in terms of stuff, because a lot of the old ones were retrofitted. And one of the things I want to make as a starting comment is it depends on what you call dangerous, because, for example, there are two that come to mind to me. One is the Armenian plant, which is one of the older reactors that were built sort of under Soviet setup, and it lacks a secondary containment field, and it's basically, in a major earthquake area. So in one sense, you could call that risky, and dangerous. And then another one is Besnau in Switzerland, which is literally the oldest nuclear plant. It opened up in 65. It started building and went live in 69. So there's those kinds of issues, and then there's more specific design issues, which maybe you and Ryan have done more research on. But there's a subjectiveness to what's the most dangerous.
Yeah, and we probably couldn't tell you for one simple reason. If it's obvious that it's dangerous, the international community will have jumped on it and provided what assistance they needed to make it less dangerous. So it's your point about the Albanian reactor is interesting. That's an earthquake zone because that's where in theory the lost nation of Atlantis fell into the ocean, right? And if you're interested in more than that, come to our Future as Seen from the 19th Century lecture tomorrow at 10 a.m. And we'll talk more about it, Vern and Atlantis. But anyway, just wanted to get the plug in.
So another question that came out was, what was the last possible moment they could have been able to stop the explosion at Chernobyl?
I would say before they got all the rods out of the reactor. If they hadn't shut off if they hadn't shut down the steam pipes when they did, that actually started the sequence of events. They probably could have just started driving rods in and shut everything down, which is what they should have done in the first place. But once they shut those steam pipes off, I think it was too late to do anything about it. If nothing else, everything else from that point on took a matter of seconds. So human reactions to understand what was going on and do something about it. I guess from that point they could have done something about it up to a few seconds before it actually happened. But they needed to understand what was going on first, and they just didn't.
The other question that came out was, where did they find all the boron?
And
I can tell you who produces boron, but I don't know.
I know the HBO series. They said, I need all the liquid nitrogen in the country. Okay, well, they probably needed all the boron in the country. No, I don't know where they got the boron. But the Soviet Union's a big country, and they had a lot of stuff. One thing you can't fault the Soviets on was the power of their industrial base. So I think they have the resources to draw on that. All right.
Any other questions?
I wanted other things about unsafe reactors. One thing to point out, we've been working on trying to improve the safety and make the design safer. So what happened in Fukushima? I said there is not necessarily, as we could see, a human element to that. What Fukushima was an earthquake and a tsunami. Now, you could probably expect a tsunami might follow an earthquake if you're in a coastal region on the rim of fire. But it was the two casualties on top of each other, that they had an emergency shutdown, loss of power, that their diesel generators were necessary to provide cooling. Everything's fine. It's all working per design. But then the tsunami came in and swamped the diesel generators. And it's almost impossible for any engineer to design something that could accommodate the effects of two separate things simultaneously, one of which defeats the safety features of the other thing. So as far as safety goes, if we're we're realizing that these we're going to have nuclear reactors in the world, and they could be operating for years, which means 100 nuclear reactors working for 10 years is 1,000 years operation. Something like that might happen once in a while, and I believe in nuclear power if it's done right, but I've yet to be convinced entirely that can be done right, because the potential for human error is always going to be there, and we continue to see that something, if you run a reactor for 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years, you keep extending this, something's going to happen that you've never designed for and not prepared for. So, other questions?
Not seeing any questions, so we'll give them another second or two here to see if they track through.
Okay.
Here's an HBO series question. In the series, they showed that the head plant engineer was present for the test but left the control room during the test. Do you know if that was really true?
If that's Borisov, they actually showed, he claimed he had left, but he was actually in the plant. I don't think anybody who had left who would have been important. If they had kept some first shift people on, they might have made the difference. But the first shift people probably wouldn't have done what they did in the first place. So anyway, what are we talking about? So
the other question was, do you feel like that reactor was known to be dangerous at the time by the Soviets, swept under the rug, or that the information was too compartmentalized for any one person to have?
The information that there were design flaws was very limited, were very closely held, and in fact, the way the series projected it, the design flaw was the use of rod followers, and as I said, I didn't think that was a design flaw. I think the design flaw is being able to pull the control rods all the way out, and the real flaw was the team that they had operating that Chernobyl reactor that actually did that and thought that was something that they should be doing. So again, we're going back to human error. But the RBMK reactor, if it's operated right, the RBMK reactor, if it's operated right, then it's a fine reactor vessel. It's a fine reactor system. But human beings don't operate it right. Human beings inherently will find one fool out of 100 people, and when you get two fools, which is 1 in 10,000 case, you get two fools in series. Suddenly, the joke's on us. At any rate, I also asked a question about the Soviet Alpha class reactors. The Alpha class was a Soviet small submarine. It used a liquid nitrogen. We talked about liquid metal as a coolant system. It used that. Now, if you try to shut it down and cool it, of course, it'll freeze solid. You can't do that. So you got to keep that system warm at least. And I think the complications of trying to do that. We tried it before with some of our own reactor systems. And the complications of trying to keep a liquid metal cooling system working, we decided just weren't. I think everybody decided just weren't worth doing. In hindsight, Richard Hart, hindsight being 2020, was the disaster handled well at the time? Yeah. Once the adults turned their eyes to it and said, "Okay, we can't shut our eyes to what's going on," they threw the resources at it to try to deal with the situation. That they dealt with the situation at hand instead of being reluctant to actually go into the entire industry and make the changes so it wouldn't happen again. That was more problematic. It's kind of typical of the Soviets to throw themselves into the war and then screw up in the peace.
One more check for questions. You like Ronald, huh? Okay, I see.
Yeah.
He's being funny.
Which,
Yeah, which one could have been well? All of them turned out badly.
Yeah, they handled it well because they shut down. They realized what the problem was, that they had a reactor core exposed and critical, and they found a way to shut it down. And then they found a way to contain it as well as they could, and they mobilized hundreds of thousands of people to clean up the area. And it wasn't anything pretty, but they did what they needed to do.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us. We still have about 8 more presentations over the course of the weekend. There's another one on Chernobyl and vacationing there, followed by a radiological lecture tonight. And then tomorrow morning we'll start off with Victorian sci-fi. So we'll look forward to seeing you through the rest of the convention. And please all
that's going to be a lot of that's going to be a lot of fun. I'm sure it's a shame we're not going to be able to do that in a conference room with a lot of people, because I imagine we're going to have some good discussions too. But it's also, we're going to have a hard time running that in 2.5 hours. Our 2.5 hour panel this morning went 3.5. But anybody who's willing to stick around, we'll keep talking as long as they're willing.
And be sure to come in costume to the Victorian sci-fi one. We're all looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'll upload your pictures of your costumes to our Facebook page.
Yes,
they can do
absolutely.
that, right? Maybe we can find a way to present that.
By the way, thank you all again. Take care. Bye.